The End of Oz, Chapter 9, Dorothy. Maybe I didn't need to win the Gnome King's favor to escape after all. Maybe I just needed a plan and a little help from Papoo. One of the little munchkins offered me a bowl of what looked like strange, glowing roots, but as I reached for the serving fork, they began to slither about like worms. "No, thank you," I said quickly, putting the fork back. I caught the Gnome King smiling with amusement at my distress, but he dropped the smirk as soon as he saw me looking at him. I picked daintily at the crust of a bread, which, although a bit on the dry side, was at least recognizable as food, and helped myself to the wine. At least they got that right in Ev. I glanced down during the final course. Some kind of spiky thing that looked distressingly like a pile of beetles in a brown sauce, which I only pretended to eat, at where Papoo had been huddled at the foot of my chair. She was gone. Much to my surprise, I hadn't even noticed her leave. Next to me, one of the diggers roared in delight and stabbed his taloned finger into the bowl of beetle-like things in front of him. They emitted a squeaking noise and began to run across the table in terror. I swallowed hard and smiled hugely, trying to hide my revulsion. Casually, I glanced around the room, but Papoo was nowhere to be seen. Maybe Papoo was going to make a better spy than I thought. Had the little creature tried to escape? Surely not. She'd only been with me for a few hours, but she seemed loyal enough. Abruptly, the Gnome King set down his fork with a thunk and stood. Everyone immediately stopped eating. "My dear guests," he began, "thank you for attending this banquet, honoring the rightful ruler of Oz, the beautiful and powerful Dorothy Gale." I smiled demurely at my plate, where several sets of legs waved at me. "She has graciously agreed to honor our realm with her most esteemed presence." I smiled even more brightly at the assembled guests. The diggers looked at me blankly. "When I'm running the show again, you'll show me the respect I deserve," I thought, gritting my teeth and grinning like a beauty pageant contestant facing the worst panel of judges in the world. "In fact," the Gnome King continued, "I have been so struck by her beauty and nobility that for the first time in several hundred years or so, my heart has been moved by her queenliness." Well, I knew he was lying, of course. He had some sinister plan to take over Oz, and he needed me to do it. But what girl couldn't help but be swayed, just a bit, by the most powerful person in 2 kingdoms proclaiming her superiority? Of course, the fact that he had taken away my magic somehow undercut the compliment. I snuck a gaze up at him, and to my surprise he was looking at me, and the expression on his face was, if I didn't know any better, I'd say he was almost telling the truth. My heart skipped unexpectedly. Was it possible that the Gnome King had feelings for me in spite of myself? And if so, could I use that to my advantage? I ignored the nagging little voice in the back of my head, the one that suggested that maybe, just maybe, I was feeling an answering spark. He wasn't what I would call traditionally handsome. He wasn't young. He wasn't particularly nice. But he was powerful, incredibly powerful, and power is something I've never been able to resist. I fluttered my eyelashes at him and he blinked. I'd startled him. I saw with a flash of pleasure. Just for a moment, I had the advantage, and I loved it. "It has occurred to me," he continued hurriedly, trying not to let me see I'd caught him off guard, "that there is one truly perfect way to join our 2 kingdoms. I widened my eyes as if I had no idea what he was talking about, even though I knew what was coming. "Dorothy," the Gnome King said, "will you rule at my side forever as my queen?" Forever. That was a word I didn't like the sound of, especially not coming from him. Forever was an awfully long time. But queen, now that was a word I liked quite a bit. None of this interim ruler until Ozma cleans the bats out of her belfry nonsense. No frumpy little coven of wicked witches breathing down my neck. No backstabbing Glinda, whoever she was now. And, best of all, no Amy Gum. I've had as long as I needed to restore my magic, thwart the Gnome King, find a way back to Oz, and take back my throne. The Gnome King was offering me the best possible solution to my dilemma, and I hadn't even had to ask for his help. Plus, while I figured out how to get back to Oz, I'd be in charge of Ev. My first order of business would be doing something about the food, and then I'd get some new clothes. The only thing I'd have to worry about I was the Queen of Ev would be its king, and I was sure I could handle him. Pretty sure, anyway. I realized everyone at the banquet hall was staring at me, even the Munchkins. I won't take no for an answer, he purred. He even managed to make it sound not menacing. How sweet. My lord, I gasped prettily, fluttering one hand over my lovely, if I do say so myself, bosom. What a marvelous shock you have given me. I rose to my feet, gazing proudly out over the silent hall. I'd showed them what a queen would look like. My chin was high, my hair glossy, my waist tiny. I had more power in my 2 red shoes than the rest of these creep show carnies had in the entire room. I was going to show them what Dorothy Gale was made of, and they weren't going to forget it. I took the Gnome King's hand and held it high over our heads. I am honored to accept your proposal, I said regally. The room was absolutely silent. The Munchkin stood motionless, gaping up at me. I saw a gray blur out of the corner of one eye that might, just might, have been Papoo's. Well, my darling, you could hardly refuse, the Gnome King said in a low voice at my side. He reached out with his bony fingers and traced the outline of my cheek, a smile ghosting across his death-white face. I shot him a radiant look. I wouldn't dream of turning down such a marvelous offer from such a wonderful man, I said, my voice husky. Once again I saw the faintest flicker of uncertainty cross his face. He'd expected me to put up a fuss, to make demands, and the fact that I was going along with him without a peep of protest was making him nervous. My smile got even brighter. 2 could play at this game. In fact, my lord, I began, but then something happened that I hadn't expected at all. My shoes flared to life with a stabbing red light that split the still air with a sudden resounding crack, like a clap of thunder. The shoes were blazing like a bonfire, scattering dazingly blood-red sparks. I was so surprised I didn't even realize the light was coming from me for several seconds. I took a startled step backward. Diggers leapt to their feet, Munchkins scattered. The Gnome King grabbed my hand again, this time squeezing so tightly I thought he'd snap the bones of my fingers. What are you doing? He hissed in my ear. I don't know, it isn't me, I protested, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He yanked me fiercely from the banquet hall, practically dragging me down the hallway back to my chambers. Behind me I could hear frantic panting. Poor Papoo, desperate to catch up. I don't know what you think you're doing, he snarled, flinging me into my room. But if you're not going to get away with it in my place, darling. Just in time, Papoo darted in behind me. The Gnome King stared at me, his silver eyes burning with rage. Stay here until I can figure out what you've done, he growled. My lord, I protested, but he slammed the door in my face. I sank down at the edge of my bed, while Papoo tried to comfort me. But I wasn't distraught. I was in shock at what I'd seen in the Gnome King's banquet hall. In that first flash of red light, it had been unmistakable. Amy. I'd seen a vision of Amy, in a cavern somewhere with the tedious little warrior boy behind her. She had my shoes. But that wasn't the most important part. I knew, as surely as I'd ever seen anything, that my vision was real, and that Amy was an Ev. Amy was here. And from the slow, sparking tingle in my toes, I knew I could use my magic again. Mistress? Papoo asked in a quavering voice. I need to think, I snapped. The little munchkin tugged at my sleeve. Mistress, please, forgive me, but it's very important. Be silent, curse you, I screeched. She cowered but continued to pluck at my dress. I learned something very important at the banquet. Finally, I opened my eyes to look at her. You did? How? I hid under the table, she said proudly. But then an expression of terrible anxiety flitted across her homely face. But I heard the king's guards whispering about you, she said. It's very bad news. Oh? How bad? She looked around, her eyes huge, but then lowered her voice even further. Mistress, the Gnome King isn't going to marry you. He's going to murder you.